moving on to Motorhead.
Josh.
Motorhead. Yeah. In the opening montage, you heard Ace of Spades, and now you are going to hear The Chase is Better Than the Catch.
The more I get, the better it is. I like it fine, I like a little whiz. Treat on my ladies, that's alright. You know the chase is better than the catch, you know. The silver-tongued devil, demon lich. I know just what I'm doing. I like a little innocent bitch. You know I ain't just screwing.
All right, Matt, what are the stats on Motorhead?
So Motorhead's Ace of Spades comes in at number 122 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums. Number 16 in 1980, number 827 of all time. It is Motorhead's highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, and it did make Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 408.
All right. Motorhead formed in 1975 after Lemmy, whose real name is Ian Fraser Kilmister, was kicked out of the band Hawkwind for being arrested in Canada for drugs. I have never heard Hawkwind before, but Mark Maron always references Hawkwind on podcasts for things, so it must be some sort of influential rock band in some way, in the same way that kind of Captain Beefheart is or something. But the name Motorhead was inspired by the last song he wrote for Hawkwind, and Lemmy played bass, as he does in Motorhead, and he recruited Larry Wallace, who we just mentioned, on guitar, and Lucas Fox on drums. Their first performance was as the opener for a band called Greenslade in London on July 20th, 1975, and then by October of that year, they were supporting Blue Oyster Cult at the Hammersmith Odeon, opening for them. Lucas Fox was kicked out of the band after proving to be unreliable, just general unreliability, nothing extrapolated.
Can you imagine how unreliable you'd need to be kicked out of Motorhead?
Yeah.
Like, listen, mate, we're in the studio today. We just need you here today. So, yeah.
Yeah, just didn't show up, or even show up late. Just didn't show up. And so he was kicked out, and in came Phil Filthy Animal Taylor to replace him.
Good choice name-wise.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
At this time, they recorded material for their label, United Artists, but the label found that the music was unreleasable, and so not suitable for ears, I guess, or not marketable, or something like that. And it was so they didn't release it, and it wasn't until after Motorhead actually got bigger and famous. More recognized, that it was released in 1979 as the album On Parole, which Motorhead does not officially endorse, I guess. In March of 1976, the band decided they wanted another guitarist, so they auditioned a guy named Fast Eddie Clark. And once he was in, Larry Wallace, who Matt mentioned, was playing in a band called the Pink Fairies. He quit, so solidified the trio of Lemmy, Phil Taylor, and Fast Eddie Clark as the trio, and they are considered the classic Motorhead lineup.
So Filthy Phil, Fast Eddie, and Lemmy Kilmister. That's up there with best names.
Right. And in April of 1977, Taylor and Clark actually decided to quit the band, and they were going to do a farewell show at the Marquee Club in London. But then Ted Carroll from Chiswick Records, who had become acquainted with Lemmy, attended that show, and he decided to offer them some studio time at Escape Studios with none other than producer Speedy Keen. to
Oh.
record a single. Do you guys remember
Oh.
Speedy King and his claim to fame, or why we talked about him previously?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
Gosh, I feel like I should because we talked about him quite a bit back.
Yes.
He was in the 60s, wasn't he?
Yep. So early 70s. He
Early
was
70s, okay.
he was the roommate and driver of Pete Townsend of the Who.
Yes,
And he
that's
wrote
right.
Armenia City in the Sky for the
Wow.
Who Sell Out.
a
And
I
blast
think
from
I
the
even
past.
mentioned this in the bio
Yeah.
back in the day. I mentioned that he was tied into Motorhead later, so I should have gotten that one.
yeah, so I thought that was funny crossover appeal there. So they went into the studio to record a single with Speedy Keen, and instead of a single, they recorded 11 tracks, followed up by 2 more at Olympic Studios, and they released the single titled Motorhead in June of 1977, followed by the self-titled album in August of 77. So that became kind of their first official release. In August of 77, they were under new management, and then by March of 78, the band had become so unstable that 2 of the 3 guys were performing in another band. So they were, I guess, side gigging, or I don't know, just not more unreliability in Motorhead. In July of 78, they released the single Louie Louie. Yes, that Louie Louie. I listened to it on Amazon.
It is hilarious.
Yes. They toured the UK on it, in fact, and they appeared on Top of the Pops in October of that year. I find Top of the Pops so fascinating because ostensibly that show is probably watched by everyone in England, and it was like, primetime television, and Motorhead is appearing on it to perform among, many other bands that we've talked about.
Well, pretty much everybody
yeah.
anybody in British music is on that, regardless of genre, which is what makes it fascinating.
Yeah, it's such a like a defining thing for British artists. But yeah,
And they all lip sync, right? Like that's kind of the big
that's
deal.
a good question. Yeah, I don't
No,
know.
I think that's it. There's a couple people who buck that trend, but yeah, you lip sync. So yeah.
Interesting. So the success of that single caused the indie label that they were on, Bronze Records, to extend their contract and put them back in the studio. So kind of always like underappreciated, it sounds like, or at least under low expectations, and they kind of exceed them. So then they released the album Overkill in March 24th, 1979, and this was their first album to break into the top 40 in the UK album charts. During July and August of 79, they started work on their next album, Bomber, which came out in October of that year. And then in May of 1980, their label released the EP, The Golden Years, which was a live album of 4 tracks. And then in August and September of 1980, they were back in the studio recording Ace of Spades. So they were really a band, I mean, like a lot of the bands we've talked about, that were basically constantly touring and then back in the studio to record things, especially around this early period of their career. They appeared on Top of the Pops twice more in October to promote the Ace of Spades single, and the single was released on October 27th, and then the album that we're talking about was released on November 8th, 1980. They toured in the UK from October to December to promote the album with openers Girls' School and Vardis. I looked at those artists because I didn't know who they were, and Girls' School is the longest running all-female rock band in history, still performing. I think some of the members have died at this point, but they are, I guess that's their claim to fame. And they also later had kind of like a crossover mashup album with Motorhead, so they kind of had some history together. This album, Ace of Spades, is their most commercially successful album and is considered to be the definitive Motorhead album. It reached number 4 on the UK charts, and even though it's their 5th studio album, if you count the On Parole release, it was their first one released in the US. This producer on this album was Vic Malley, and it was recorded at Jackson Studios in Rickmansworth, England, which is in southwest England. I looked that up. He is credited with giving the band a sleeker sound, in the studio, and the band credits him for holding them accountable during recording and making them work hard. They band kind of described him as being a softer, smaller guy, but with had an edge to him and spoke loudly, even though he spoke softly, his words kind of carried weight and they took him seriously.
Carried a large stick, if you will.
Yes, like Teddy Roosevelt. The album cover has a Wild West motif, as you saw, and it was taken at a quarry in North London. Each of their outfits is based on a fictional Western character from movies or TV. Eddie was based on Clint Eastwood's character, the man with no name. That's the one on the right with the poncho from the Dollars trilogy, Fistful of Dollars for a Few Dollars More, and the most famous one that I'm now blanking on.
The famous one.
Yeah. Phil's costume was based on Marlon Brando's character in One-Eyed Jacks, which is a movie, and Lemmy's character was inspired from Brett Maverick from the TV show Maverick. Was
that the inspiration for the Twin Peaks One-Eyed Jacks, Josh?
Probably, yeah. And then, interestingly, the sky is not real in that cover. It was airbrushed in, so I thought that was funny. What else? I got some other things. Motorhead never really classified themselves as always classified themselves as rock and roll. But when Jeff Barton coined the term new wave of British heavy metal, which Matt brought up a couple weeks ago, they were lumped in with other bands like Iron Maiden, Saxon, and Def Leppard. And Motorhead's also been considered proto-thrash and would go on to influence thrash metal bands like Metallica and Megadeth. Lemmy has said that he always felt more of a kinship with punk rockers than with heavy metal bands. And he also said they had more in common aesthetically with The Damned than Black Sabbath, and had nothing in common with Judas Priest. So he had strong feelings on what his band was defined as. You may ask yourself, why is there an umlaut over the O in Motorhead? And Lemmy has said that they just put that in there to look mean and badass. So there is no pronunciation difference or.
And Motley Crue said, "We're just going to do that same shit."
Yep. Similar to Blue Oyster Cult as well.
Does that make it look badass?
I'll leave it to you to decide that.
You think all right.
Not on this album, funnily enough, but they are known for having a fang-faced logo with oversized tusks, chains, and spikes created by artist Joe Patagino in 1977, and it's commonly known as the War Pig or Snaggletooth. So I just really have a final coda after we talk about the album. So what did you guys think of Ace of Spades?
I guess I start right on this one.
Yep.
I have always felt that Motorhead, it's funny you mentioned the punk rock. I always felt Motorhead was a lot more like the Ramones than they were like metal. And that's why I love metal and I love punk. Motorhead always seemed to me more like the Ramones in that they had this thing they did, right? And they did this thing for years. And I like the thing they do, but to some degree, the thing they do is the thing they do, right? And then it just kind of comes down to how you perceive individual songs, like Ace of Spades, like great song, right? Like kind of the best version of their sound, kind of like the Blitzkrieg Bop, or I Want to Be Sedated, right, of their sound. I think the thing that always is tricky for me with Motorhead is the fact I remember hearing Motorhead described as like amphetamines rock, like speed rock, and that's the best thing I've ever heard them described as. They're clearly derived from blues rock, right? They're not quite punk, they're not quite metal. They have the metal sort of aesthetic mixed with the blues aesthetic visually, right, and sonically, but they play fast like punk, and they have sort of a devil may care attitude like punk does too. So that's the Motorhead take right there. Sonically, this album, I mean, Lemmy has such a distinctive, voice. And the bass guitar in this album just thuds throughout the entire. The guitars are fast, and then Lemmy's bass guitar just like thunders over everything on this album, for me at least. That's what I hear, because the drums are basically just pounding and like the kick, right? That's what you hear the whole time. Just kick drum, pounding, kick drum, and then Eddie Clark's just doing solos, but the solos are in the construct of this speed, and that's why to some degree I get the thrash, right? Because they play fast. They don't play as fast as thrash metal, but they play fast, and so I get that. This album has always been middle of the road for me. Motorhead's I enjoy the idea of Lemmy and sort of the idea of what Motorhead is. I like hard rock, and it's perfectly cromulent hard rock for me. Motorhead kind of never raises, though, to that level where there's anything virtuoso or there's anything that stands out for me personally. It's just funny because early in my life, Motorhead was just, I was listening to metal, and then Motorhead would come in, and it's like, well, it's kind of the not quite metal, but it's kind of like the hard rock band I don't quite like as much as, Iron Maiden or Metallica or bands like that, right? And they're not doing anything there. And I don't quite like it. I don't connect with it viscerally as much as I connect with punk. Like I connected with the Ramones or, the Clash or Sex Pistols, stuff that was sneering there, because Lemmy did not seem like just a guy you could be like the punk rock bands did, right? He was this he was like a roadie for Jimi Hendrix, right? I think was part of his story. And, he just kind of lived this like hard life. I mean, I think I saw a documentary one time. He's like, every day I drank and, did amphetamines. And I mean, the fact that this guy lasted till like his mid 70s is like remarkable. Yeah. Like once again, that rock and roll DNA. So that's kind of where and then of course Motorhead reinvents themselves as like, wrestling theme song band, which they're almost perfectly built to be, right? Like create crunching wrestling theme songs because they're heavy, but not so heavy that they can't be accessible. And that ultimately to me is kind of where Motorhead stands for me. I liked this album. I didn't love this album. That would be the best way to describe it. I would also be remiss if I did not mention that there were hilarious lyrics on this. I'm going to give you my two favorites from this. From Jailbait, which was one of my favorite songs, right in the vein of like 16 by Iggy Pop.
I wrote that down too, yeah.
Christine 16 by Kiss or something, all kinds of songs about. And what was that Led Zeppelin song about, like that Robert Plant wrote about watching, Jimmy Page date the one, baby groupie or whatever. But I don't care about our different ages. I'm an open book with well-thumbed pages. That made me laugh out loud. But perhaps I also like, just what I'm doing. I like a little innocent bitch. I ain't just screwing. That was on there as well from the Chase to Catch. And then the hammer, which was basically a metaphor for a penis, but the whole time. But my favorite in that one was that he ends each one with, believe me, the hammer's going to smash your dream. And line 2 was, I'm in your life, just might be in your wife. It's like the one that actually made me almost spit out my drink, especially coming from Lemmy with those like that voice. So I did feel I had to shout out some of my favorite hilarious lines. There's also like a simplicity of rhyme on this album that is kind of like when you write poetry in elementary school and they're like, okay, make sure every other line rhymes or every second line rhymes, right? And you're like, what rhymes with back, track? What rhymes with way, day? That like a little bit of writing here. So not to be, overly critical, but it does kind of make me laugh because it just seemed like everything is perfectly built to be able to be rhymey, while also adding in, not so subtle sexual innuendo. So shout out to the basics of lyric writing.
Let me add my favorite lyric, which is on Fast and Loose. Also about sex, where he says, just let me finish ... writing this song.
That's fantastic. So there you go. Yes, the theme of this album seems to be sex 80% of the time, no one can tame my independent spirit 15% of the time, and then an ode to my road crew the other 5% of the time. So lyrical themes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you guys hit on my biggest question coming from these listens, which was, what genre does this fall in, right? Because it's I definitely was thinking it's a cross between metal and punk, And I just was thinking, well, is this what speed metal? Like I was like, oh yeah, it's fast like punk, right? But it's definitely metal because of there's like guitar solos and there's like technical playing that's happening here that you're not really going to get in punk. What it does have in common with Judas Priest is some big guitar riffs, right? Which were really some really good guitar riffs. That guitar riff in Love Me Like a Reptile is awesome. It's just, that might be my favorite song on this record. It was just, I love that from the get-go. I was like, that's a cool ass riff. And there's several of them throughout this album. So, and so that's kind of where I was like, well, maybe this is the beginning of thrash, So a lot of those terms that you guys have already brought up were kind of going on in my head. It's also not metal because I think a while back maybe that was an essential question, is like, well, what's the difference between hard rock and metal? And I found a couple of definitions. And I remember saying, looking at it, and they were saying how the lyrical content in hard rock is much more about sex, and in metal it's much more about, like, I don't know, it's like the Led Zeppelin, like, Tolkien kind of thing, like mystical kind of like demons and stuff like that. But this is definitely sex. And so this is more hard rock in that realm, in that regard, as far as the lyrics go. So I actually like this album a lot. I thought it was pretty consistent. I thought it was more consistent than Judas Priest. I thought that Judas Priest had some more generic hard rock songs. I pretty much liked every one of these songs. Lemmy's voice gets a little wearing, somewhat. It's just it's certainly distinct, but it wasn't too off-putting or anything like that where I was like, oh, I'm sick of this. But it was definitely, he doesn't have a good voice, but for this type of music, it suits it fine, I think. This was an interesting listen because, unlike most of the albums, it was hard to parse the music from the lyrics because they are it's easy to understand them. And it's a little like coming from Lemmy, just like picturing this guy who, like, I already know what he looks like, right? And just his voice and stuff. This is the musical sound of a sexual predator. This guy is just like, it's like most of the songs, like Fast and Loose is like, I'm going to knock at your door at 2 a.m. I'm going to wake you up and you're going to be okay eventually. Don't get up, get down instead. Like, and Jailbait and like, the Hammer and Chase is Better Than the Catch. It's like, this is a creepy dude. And like seeing some stories about him and documentaries and articles and whatnot, like this was very much him, like try to like let me sleep with as many people as I can and like unabashed, like I don't care, and so like just that image is just, it's like, yeah, he's a lot creepy, right? And it was hard to parse that away because I really did like the riffs and the music, and then I also felt like, man, I'm kind of creeped out listening to some of this stuff, and just like could a band, we talked about this with the Rolling Stones and Mick Jagger before, right? Could a band operate in this lane like with these lyrics today? I don't know if that would go over so well, and if it did, it certainly wouldn't sell like this album did, or would be as popular
most of
as
them. But yeah, you couldn't write a song called Jailbait anymore.
No.
Yeah, it's just like full blown. Like I don't care about your age. That doesn't matter, So that was kind of interesting because I do really like the music on.
You're
this.
Backstage, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah.
That's kind of like the vibe. That's what he's like. We don't need to talk about that. You're backstage, so let's go. Yeah, that you couldn't get away with that.
So while I like the music, I feel dirty listening to this album. Like it's just it's that palpable for me. But it's got some great guitar riffs. This is great. I did like this a lot, and I thought musically it was pretty consistent. So yeah, I'm gonna go thumbs up with a little caveat of feeling a little. I don't know. Lemmy's kind of a scary dude. We've
been there before. We've been there before, though, with that Serge Gainsbourg album and the Iggy Pop album. So
Yes, but Serge it was different. This is it's the combination of like the sex, but also like he's a scary looking, like he's like he's a dude that I think, like, I don't know. Physically menacing kind of dude, you know what I mean, like a scary dude. So it's just one of those things. Yes, we've heard similar themes before, but this guy is, I don't know, it seemed much more prevalent here for me than maybe another artist that we've covered.
Yeah, I'm kind of like John. I thought I didn't really know Motorhead outside of Ace of Spades, and I think that's their, obviously it's their most well-known song, but it's probably one of their best songs too. There's not really any surprises with Motorhead. You know what you're getting. It's pretty fast. It's pretty aggressive. It's not trying to be too clever in the way that or tongue in cheek. They're not flashy in the way that AC/DC is, or maybe even something like Iron Maiden has a bit more like, technical flashiness, and then they're being a bit more elaborate, I would say, than Motorhead. So, and Lemmy's voice is such a distinct part of this band as well. It's it's kind of gravelly, it's raspy, it's a signature part of their sound. So it's very straightforward hard rock, and it's but there is not a lot of deviation or experimentation in that. I think that, Matt, you said you like the guitar riffs and stuff, and there's some good stuff, but there's not a lot of, kind of similar to the whole kind of MO of their song and sound. They're not really extended guitar solos anywhere. They're not really trying to show off in that aspect as well. They're pretty fast and short guitar solos. There are good guitar riffs, but maybe not as recognizable or drawn out in the way that AC/DC or even Judas Priest was on certain songs. The guitar riff on Breaking the Law is kind of different than the song like Shoot You in the Back, which I like that guitar riff on that song on this album. But you see what I'm saying? They're not really trying. I feel like they're not really trying to prove anything. They're just there. They're playing the music. They're playing it their way. And I think they are. I mean, I haven't heard other Motorhead songs, but you can pretty much get all of their themes that they're interested in off of this. Gambling, women, rock and roll, drugs, like all kind of the staples. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel and do anything out of the ordinary. Now, maybe later on they do. I mean, they put out like almost 30 albums in their entire career. So how many times can you write about the same thing? Well, I guess whole bands have made careers on it. So you might, if you are interested, you could listen to those albums and let me know. But I think because you kind of get who they are within one album, and there was nothing that jumped out at me too terribly much in this in terms of experimentation or a tinge of what else do you have to offer. Is there something a little, again, I wouldn't say it's generic, but there's not a lot of depth there either. There wasn't something that made me want to say, okay, who are the bands that were influenced by Motorhead, or let me listen to more of Motorhead to see what they have to offer. I feel like you could probably pick any of these songs and know who Motorhead is, and either appreciate them. They're like really good music to work out to. That's a staple of mine too. They're fast. They fill you up with energy. They're kind of in that punk rock mode, like you said. But there's no, they're not commenting on societal issues like some punk rock bands. They're not the Dead Kennedys by any measure in terms of political awareness. They're writing.
Do they even know what's going on in society? Like, is that even something on their radar?
I think it's more just a conscious choice to not give a shit,
Yeah,
and just live existentially day to day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're very much in the moment. So if that's your way of living, then you'll probably really like Motorhead. Just to wrap up, this band continued until Lemmy's death in December of 2015, albeit with some different lineups throughout the years. They did release around 30 more albums by my count. And Phil Filthy Animal Taylor died in November of 2015, so 1 month before Lemmy did. And then Fast Eddie Clarke died in 2018. So the entire entire lineup of this band is no longer with us, and original guitarist Larry Wallace died in 2019, as Matt said in This Day in Music History, and they are not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They were nominated in 2020 but did not get in. So I guess that's kind of, they're like good, but not good enough to get in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I guess.
I guess that means they're metal.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what that means. So,
Yep.
How does that work? Is there like a certain period of time with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame where you don't make it in, like after X amount of nominations, then you can't ever go in again or something? It's like the Baseball Hall of Fame. Is there like
who gives a shit? Really,
I'm just
at the end of the
curious.
day?
I think
I'm just
there is
curious.
like 3 nomination periods, and if you don't get in, then you can never get in.
Yeah. I might look that up.
But yeah.
But
Something
then they have
tells
like
me Lemmy didn't lose a day of his life thinking about going into
no.
the
But then they
Hall
have
of
like
Fame.
then they have those things where they're like, oh well, like Kraftwerk, like you're not officially in, but you're going to get a recognition. It's just it doesn't make sense.
But that's all I have on Motorhead. Sounds like we're lukewarm to positive overall on that.
Yeah, I liked it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say right in the middle for me.
Yep. Yeah, same.